Hey, Rabbi.
Hey, Aaron, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Doing fine.
All right. Thanks for answering my emails.
Oh, you're welcome. I enjoy the
Really appreciate that.
conversation.
I read them all.
I can tell because you always ask good questions about them.
Shalom, Rabbi.
Hello.
Hello, Jose, Regina. Just getting all the different windows and screens set up on the monitors and bits and such. All right, now we just wait a few minutes and make sure that everybody else has logged in who needs to log in. Gives me a chance to get a drink of tea.
Joy.
I'm going to go ahead and make a reminder now, but I will repeat it again at the end. Next week, because it'll be the day before Rosh Hashanah, we will not be having class. Next week, since it's the day before Rosh Hashanah, we will not be having class.
Okay. Thanks for telling me.
There's
No
Mishnah
problem.
class, though, right?
There will be Mishnah on Wednesday, because that's 2 days before Rosh Hashanah, so I can deal with that. But day before
like
Rosh Hashanah is a bit much.
It matches the Mishnah we learned.
Yes, it does, actually.
Okay, so you said that we don't have a class.
Next Thursday, no class. But Aaron was asking about the Wednesday class, and yes, there will be.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, and Tommy, good to see you on the YouTube chat.
You talking to me?
No, I was talking to someone on the YouTube. I've got you guys live in the Zoom. I've got people watching on YouTube texting and trying to keep all the different channels in view. All right, well, no time like the present. Let's go ahead and get started. We are actually going to talk today about what most people consider to be a very sad, maybe even depressing topic. That is to say, mourning, meaning how do we deal with the loss of a loved one? Judaism absolutely believes in sadness. Judaism believes very much in crying. We are not a stoic religion. We do not hide and pretend that our grief never happened. Even though we are certainly confident that those who have passed from this world are cared for by God and their souls are eternal, we are still sad that they are not here in this world, in this life with us right now. And so we mourn. And in fact, Judaism has a very structured mourning procedure that is designed to both give us room for feeling sad, as well as to gradually reintroduce us to a life that now does not contain our loved one, but can have still new joys and new moments of happiness even without them. But of course, that takes time and that takes many different steps. So with that as the generic introduction, let's get into some specifics. In Judaism, it is considered that there is a number of different periods in the mourning process, like I mentioned, steps. And the first is between the death of a loved one and the actual burial of the loved one. It's called oninut. And during this period, it is characterized by shock, by being stunned at the loss. Even in the modern world where losses are often easier to predict, meaning that people will often battle an illness for many days, weeks, or perhaps even years, that moment when they are gone is still a moment where our emotions have difficulty adjusting, difficulty changing. And that's why it's considered to be a moment of shock for the mourner. Now, who do we actually mourn for? This is very important. Judaism believes that we mourn we are required to mourn only for those who are in the immediate generational circle around us, meaning we mourn for our parents, the generation above. We mourn for our siblings or spouse, the generation connected to us. And we mourn for our children, the generation beneath us. These are the required people we mourn for. It is certainly possible and appropriate to mourn for others. Indeed, one does mourn for the loss of one's teacher by law, but to mourn for a grandparent, to mourn for a grandchild, well, we need to make sure that we are differentiating, we're finding the difference between the required mourning practices and grieving for a loss. Of course, you can grieve and be sad and participate in all of the family get-togethers for the loss of somebody that is a grandparent, an uncle, a grandchild, a second cousin, a dear friend, a parent-in-law, whoever you wish. Our sadness can spread to anybody who has touched us, and that we can then express our pain at their loss. What this is talking about is those for whom we are obligated to mourn. So if you don't have a connection to your second cousin, you're not obligated to mourn for them in any of the ways that are about to follow. However, in the modern world where death has become much less common, and therefore people are not often overburdened with the requirements of mourning, many people have chosen to assume the obligations of mourning that we will discuss for people that were not in this immediate circle. So I have met people who have taken on the different mourning practices for a grandparent, especially if that grandparent was instrumental in raising them. I have seen people take on mourning obligations for a grandchild, of course, because every grandparent feels that pain very deeply. But one thing I do want to leave as a possible question that should be discussed within the family and with the rabbi if necessary is if the broader circle of the family wishes to assume the mourning obligations, not only the grief, but the obligations, which we will list in just a moment, then there should be a conversation. Because those who are most close to the deceased, the ones who fit in the categories that we're looking at right here, they are first in line, and we must take care of their needs first before we presume to add ourselves into the group of people who need consolation from the rest of the community. That is to say, if there is a parent who has lost a child, God forbid, if a grandparent comes on too strong with their desire to be one of the mourners, it can sometimes pull the attention away from the parent and move it to the grandparent, leaving the parent without the consolation of community and extended family. So this is something that it can be very delicate to navigate. And that's why, as an obligation, only this immediate circle is obligated to mourn. Aaron, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, briefly. Is this why they put in the Mishnah where Gamliel mourns for his slave Toby? Was to show how broad it actually can be?
Exactly right. It is certainly possible, but it's not required to mourn for people in different statuses, whether it be a friend, even a beloved servant, or someone like that. Now, one of the other things the rabbis were very concerned with, and one of the things that we see as an overall pattern within Jewish mourning is not supposed to become a permanent status. That is to say, I know in some communities, some cultures, some other religions, when a person has buried a loved one, they become a mourner forever. You will see widows wearing black from the moment their husband died until the moment the widow joins them in the grave. Or a child who will wear a piece of torn cloth or a black armband forever for the loss of a loved one. There are people who get permanent tattoos for the loss of a loved one. And while Judaism does believe in having markers for those whom we have lost at the gravestone, and certainly has other rituals we take on an annual basis to call them to mind, mourning is not supposed to be a way of life for 365 days of the year, for every day, for every year of your life. It is supposed to fit in when it is triggered by these events, and then we are meant to be guided through it to be able to rejoin life and have a normal life. mourning forever, even for the most painful or tragic loss you could imagine, to make that our daily life is the antithesis of what Torah stands for. Torah wants us to live this life and to find in it all of the beauty and pleasure we can, even with that tragedy having occurred. We have to stop. We must mourn. It can be a lengthy process, but it is not a permanent status for us to have. And certainly in the ancient world, where death was much more common, meaning that everybody would be burying children, everybody would be burying a brother or sister. Most people would bury a spouse, more than one in many cases. And of course, everybody would bury their parents. This was a very important reminder that the purpose of Judaism is not grief. The purpose of Judaism is to help us through our grief. Okay, so what happens during this period for the onen, the person that is in this in-between time between the death of their loved one and the burial? Well, we have no substantial meals, right? This is not a time to sit down and have a big dinner or a feast. We don't eat meat, we don't drink wine. Those are symbols of joy. We do not have to and should not do the Shema or wear tefillin or engage in other positive commandments, such as study or other things, because our full attention must be given to preparing the deceased for the burial. We do not have marital relations, meaning intimacy with our spouse. We do not bathe. We do not anoint with oils or fragrances. We do not do other joyful activities. We also begin no longer cutting our hair or shaving. And as I already mentioned, the Torah study, and we do not engage in our business. Everything is focused entirely on preparing the deceased for burial. That is our number one and singular obligation at that moment. Questions or comments? Does that make sense? Okay. At the end, when we are about to do the funeral, either before or at the graveside, depending upon customs in different communities, we do what is called kriya. Kriya is the tearing of one's clothes. We tear over the left-hand side, close to the heart, as a sign of the connection between our heart, our very body, and our parents. And we tear over the right-hand side for all others. Whether it be a spouse, a sibling, or a child, we tear on the right-hand side. In the modern day, when our clothes are made of very tough fabric rather than homespun wool and woven cloth, it can be sometimes difficult to tear our own clothes. And so many people will actually attach a piece of cloth that is more tearable, so that way they can tear it and still perform this mitzvah. This is the oldest sign of grief that is seen in the entire Torah as an action. Obviously, tears are even older, but as a way of showing our deep distress at hearing the news of someone dying or it being there for the funeral, tearing is really the most ancient aspect of our grief rituals. We wear that tear, that is to say, we wear the clothes or cloth with the tear in it throughout the Shiva period. I'll explain what Shiva is in just a bit. When we are doing this tear, there is a blessing that we recite. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, dayan ha'emet, which is our usual introduction. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, the true judge. We are reminding ourselves that at this time of loss, that God is a true judge, meaning, of course, that we can trust that God has seen the truth and judges in truth the life, the spirit, the soul of our loved one. Once Shiva is over, again, that we'll talk about exactly what period that is in just a minute, then we can stitch it back up in a temporary way. And then after shloshim, you could repair the cloth completely. Now, if it is for a parent, however, we never completely mend that tear. Again, this is not quite as relevant in the modern world where many people will not actually have the clothes at Torn directly because they seem to be less capable. But if you have more questions on that, please let me know. So obviously, we then also have the burial. We bury our loved ones as soon as possible. To unnecessarily delay the burial is considered to be very disrespectful to the deceased. We know from the Torah that even a criminal should be buried the same day they are executed. All the more so for a loved one who is not guilty of any crime, we should not delay their burial at all. However, we now know that sometimes there are reasons why we need to delay for their honor or for safety. So if it was the middle of a hurricane, of course, we would wait until the storm passed before we buried. And if we knew that a primary mourner was hurrying back for the funeral, a child, for example, who was on a business trip, who was coming back for their parents' funeral, we can delay for a short time in order to allow them to be there to pay their respects for the deceased. But we don't postpone a funeral just for convenience. We don't say, oh, you know, Thursday's a little busy, or Friday I was going to go see the baseball game. No, no, no. We only delay for the honor of the deceased, not for any other considerations. When it comes to eulogies, that is to say, the speeches that are given in honor of the dead, they can be given anywhere. Local customs will vary if this is done at the graveside or at a memorial chapel. In Baltimore, we almost always had the memorial service with eulogies at the funeral home, and then did the graveside service out of the graveyard. Here in Orlando, almost all the funerals have everything take place at the cemetery rather than be divided between different locations. It is also, though, even if it takes place off-site for the eulogies, everyone should, if they are able, be there for the levaya, for the escorting of the deceased to their rest. And that, of course, includes at the graveside of moving from the chapel where the speeches are given to the graveside. We escort the deceased until they reach their final rest. We bury people in simple wooden coffins where required. In Israel, coffins are not required, and people are still buried in shrouds, that is to say, in cloth wrapping. And that way they are allowed to be in touch with the earth, because we do not want any barriers that would prevent the body, the person, from returning to the earth from which we are all made. God made us from the earth, and our body returns to the earth. And we don't use metal coffins. We don't use any sort of above ground, detached from the earth burial chambers. We make sure the person is connected to the earth as easily as possible. In most places in America, a coffin is required, and so we use a simple natural material coffin for burials. For the same reasons, we also do not embalm. We don't use chemicals to preserve the body. The body should decay. That is part of the natural cycle that God gave us. And we do not engage in autopsies unless it is required by local laws. We consider anything that is being done unnecessarily to the body as being disrespectful to the form. Any questions or comments on that point, or on any of these points up to this stage? Okay. So Shiva. Shiva is the period that lasts 7 days from the burial. Now, again, burial could be the same day as the passing. Burial could be the next day or maybe 2 days after. That's sort of the usual window in this country. But from once that burial takes place, our focus moves from the deceased to giving condolences to those that are grieving, to the mourners. And for a period of 7 days, they're in a status known as Shiva. You'll often hear this referred to as sitting Shiva. You'll often hear or see emails we send out inviting people to come to Shiva. This is what we are talking about. So during this Shiva period, the 7 days following the burial, and the day of the burial is day 1, and the morning of day 7 is the end. During this period, you stay home. And this is the hardest thing for a lot of people to get their head around. Right? This doesn't mean it's a vacation. This means that you stay home. This is to avoid any distractions. You may remember I said at the very beginning that Judaism wants us to be sad. It wants us to grieve. One of the ways it does that is by forcing us to not be distracted by being out in our jobs, being out among our casual friends, or being in our normal mode of behavior, but by forcing us to be home, where we must confront our grief. Because, of course, you still need to have services, as we'll talk about, especially with regards to Kaddish. That means that we join and gather with the people in their homes. So that's why you'll see when somebody has passed, we will let you know when the family is welcoming people into their house for those services. And then you can go to Shiva, visit them for Shiva to pay your respects. But if the person is, as they should be, staying home the entire time, you can drop by and visit them for Shiva at any time during those 7 days. Although usually we do not do those types of visits on Shabbat. During the 7 days, we continue with no haircuts, no shaving, again, no marital relations, no bathing, no anointing, no wearing leather shoes being a sign of arrogance. You may notice that those are also similar to our behavior on fast days in Yom Kippur. We do not wear freshly pressed clothes. That is too much of a sign of self-pampering. We don't eat anything like a festive meal. We're not eating, big or elaborate or nice dishes. We're just eating simple food. We do not engage in purely social activities. Of course, friends coming, talking, sharing memories, that is perfectly fine. But this is not the time to be playing, a game. This is not the time for mahjong or for bridge. This is a time for more or less enjoyable pursuits. We don't engage in our business. You don't go into the office. You don't do work from home. You let them get on without you, whatever that may be. Now, a lot of people have difficulty, especially now in the economy, taking 7 days off for grief, which is a shame about how our society is structured, but that's not here nor there. If you need to go back to work, then to begin to do some work after the 3rd day is considered to be permissible if there is great need. But in general, we try to refrain from work the entire 7 days. It is also our practice to sit on the floor, or if that is not physically possible for you, a low stool. Again, making us feel that sense of grief and lowness. It is also custom to light a lamp or a candle that will burn for 7 days. They're usually quite tall. And we leave that in the area where we are most likely to be spending our time as sort of a reminder of the soul of the departed. There is also a custom in many communities of covering mirrors. That is, of course, because mirrors were usually considered to be a sign of preparing for our most enjoyable activities, getting ready, so to speak. And of course, that is not what we should be focused on at that time. Questions on these Shiva observances? Okay. If you go to Shiva, and you should, even if you didn't know the deceased, and even if you don't know the mourner, but simply as part of your community, you can often wonder, what am I supposed to say to them, right? In English, we often say, I'm sorry for your loss. I gave a sermon about this a little while ago. It's an okay sentence, but it still doesn't give all that it should. By tradition in Judaism, instead, what we ask is, you say, Hamakom Yenachem Etchem, B'toch Sha'ar Avelei Tzion Yerushalayim, which means may the ever-present, meaning God, comfort you among the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. So what is this saying is that we know we cannot take away your grief with our words. We know that only time, through the gift and strength of God and the practices of our faith, will you, like all others who also grieve, be able to eventually find your way out of the darkness that you are in. And then, and this is very important, and then you shut up. meaning you let the mourner direct the conversation, if any. If they wish to talk, they talk, and you can talk with them. If they want to share a story, that's great. If they want you to share a story, that's great. If they want to sit in silence, you sit with them in silence. You let them steer how you can comfort them, rather than saying, "Oh, let me show you pictures of my grandkids." That way you won't be thinking about having lost your brother. No, this is not the time for that kind of social interaction that we might normally do when we visit a friend. Instead, you let them guide. If they want to have a conversation, you follow their lead. If they want to be in silence, you sit with them in silence. Your presence is a beautiful gift that you can give them. Your words could go wrong, and sometimes saying nothing is saying the best thing. The Talmud says that the reward for going to visit those that are grieving comes from your silence, right? Just showing up is what's important. And once you open up your mouth, you could get in trouble. So let them lead, and then you'll know what you should do. All right. Shloshim. From the time that the person is buried for the full 30 days, so the first 7 days are part of it, but the full 30 days is considered shloshim. So we have before the burial on the nut, we have from the burial for 7 days shiva, and we have from the burial for 30 days shloshim. Okay. During shloshim, we continue these practices of not having festive and joyous meals, not engaging in social activities that are just for fun, not having our shave or a haircut, not wearing our freshly pressed clothes. And many people do begin to start washing up again, but they do so in ways that are dampened. Sorry. That is to say, usually cold water or lukewarm water. It's not, bathing in the ancient world was always considered something that was done for pleasure. But if you need to bathe just for pure hygiene and do it in a way that is clearly not designed to make you happy or enjoy the moment, then that is okay during the rest of Shloshim. Oh, pardon. Before I get to the next section, I just want to go back to, where are we? Up there. Our list of those that we are required to mourn for. So you remember, it's parents, siblings, spouse, children. For siblings, spouse, and children, mourning officially ends at Shloshim, 30 days from the day of burial. That is the end of our mourning period for a sibling, a spouse, or a child. Our parents, we extend much longer. I'll get to the parents in just a minute. Let me go back and get ready for that. There we are. But let me explain what's going on here. Why would we only mourn for a child, of all things, only 30 days, let alone a spouse, maybe whom you've shared your life for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, you only grieve for 30 days? No, that's not what this is trying to say. Like I explained at the very beginning, grief was something that was, death was something that was too common in the ancient world. And that meant that if mourning was obliged to be longer than this, if we were obligated to mourn more extensively for anyone else, that we would end up spending the majority of our life mourning. As you're going to see, for our parents, we mourn for an entire year by certain practices. And you can imagine that's 2 years out of your life. If you might have lived to 50, 60 years old in the old world, that's 2 years out of 60. And then you've buried your spouse, that would be 3 years. And then you have maybe 6, 7, 8 brothers or sisters. That's another 8 years that you are in mourning. Now we're up to 11 years, right? And then you have children that you have buried. Maybe you've lost 3 or 4 children in your life. So now you're up to 15 years. Well, from once you're a full adult at 20 to let's be generous and say 60, that would be more than 25% of your life spent grieving, spent in obligatory mourning practices. That's too much. That would simply be taking too much of our life and putting it and emphasizing the grave. And that is not what Judaism emphasizes first and foremost. We emphasize this world, this life. So the rabbi said, you are only obligated for 30 days for everyone but your parents. So there's only going to be 2 years for a mother and a father that you are mourning the entire 1 year cycle for each. However, if you wish to mourn for others longer, that is permissible. Again, remembering, as I said way back at the beginning, without turning mourning into the normal behavior. So if you need to mourn for a year for a child, a year for a parent, yes, that is permissible in the modern world because our lives are much longer and our contact with death much less frequent. But still, no one should go beyond that year mark because it is important not to make mourning our constant companion. So 365 days from the burial, we are continuing our mourning for our parents only. And that means that we continue not to have festive party type meals. We continue not to have purely social activities. This is not the time of year, not the year that you want to be going to the comedy club or going to the symphony. This is a year where you are reflecting that you have lost one of the two people that gave you life and one of the people that has supported you throughout your life. Even if your relationship with a parent has not always been ideal, sometimes it can be even very much far from ideal, it is still a time of reflection of where you came from. And if you cannot mourn in the most extreme cases of abuse for the person they were, you can mourn for the person that they were not, meaning that you can grieve for that year that you never had a chance to have a relationship with a parent that could have been kinder and more supportive and more loving. But for most people, most parents are a mix, right? None of us are perfect, and none of our parents are perfect. That is something we all come to realize as we get older. That doesn't mean that our love for them and our honor for them should diminish. As long as they are not being harmful or abusive, we still owe them that honor and that love. It is also customary during this year to sit in a different place. Throughout the year, most people will develop what's called a makom kavua, a set place, a particular seat in the synagogue where they normally sit. And during this year, we are out of place. And so you move to another place in the sanctuary during that year. Questions on that? Okay. Whenever we talk about mourning, one of the things that comes up is saying the Kaddish. The Kaddish is officially what's called a doxology, which is a very fancy Greek word that's trying to make a statement of belief, make a statement of what it is that we wish to proclaim about God. It is a very beautiful recitation in Aramaic, describing how God is beyond our understanding. We say Kaddish during every service, which would mean every daily service and including the additional services on Shabbat or holidays. And we say the Kaddish as a mourner. There are specific Kaddishes that are reserved for the mourners that we do for 30 days for our relatives. When it comes to a parent, we do it for 11 months. That is to say, although I said we mourn in the other ways for the full year, for the Kaddish, we do it a little bit short. Why is that? Well, to understand that, we have to understand what is behind why the Kaddish has become such a powerful part of Jewish mourning. In Jewish belief, we feel that from at least our perspective, because of course, God and the next world is beyond time, but from our perspective, that period after death is a time of judgment for the soul, right? When God is weighing what the soul has done, both for the good and for the bad. In order to help the soul, explaining in just a second, we perform mitzvot, we perform commandments in his or her honor. Why is this helping? Because it shows the lasting impact of their deeds in this world. Meaning that when we do something that is good or righteous while calling our loved one to mind, we are testifying to God that what they did caused what I just did. We are giving evidence that they were a righteous and worthwhile person because I have been influenced by them to do what I am currently doing. So by my recitation of the Kaddish, by my giving of tzedakah, by my dedication of my time to study, I am showing that their life is impacting this world. The good that they did is still happening. It's like having a return on an investment even after the person has died. And that means that they get the credit for this. So by doing this, we are supporting them by adding to the total good that they have done in this world. Clearly, since parents have the greatest impact and for whom we have the greatest respect, we recite the Kaddish for the whole time of judgment. However, as this is a time of judgment in the Ashkenazic world, we reasoned, well, wait a minute. I don't want to imply that my parent needs all 12 months of additional help in judgment. So you'll find most communities will end the recitation of Kaddish 11 months from the burial. That's our way of saying, I want to help my parents as much as possible, but I'm not going to help them so much that it looks like I think they need all the help they can get. Because of course, I would never believe that they were that terrible of a person that they would need all of this additional support. But I'm also not going to do less than I should, because of course, I want to make sure I've given all the support I can. This is a lovely little bit of Jewish logic. Questions or comments on this point? Okay. Now, like I said, the Kaddish is, oh, yes? Okay, like I said, the Kaddish is a doxology. It is a statement of faith. It also requires a minyan, that is to say 10 Jewish adults. And that means that because we are declaring God's greatness publicly. And that means, of course, that as far as the emotional impact of the Kaddish goes, as you say the Kaddish, and you are making your connection to God stronger, and as you say the Kaddish with your community, you are making your connection to the community stronger. You are also reminding yourself as you stand in the community that there are others too who have lost loved ones, whether they are also reciting Kaddish at the same time, or whether they are a member of the congregation who is answering your prayer as you are engaged in this. And of course, since we are leading the congregation in the Kaddish, we are, of course, adding on additional merit to our loved ones because we are helping to encourage the response and the growth of the other members of the congregation at the same time. So really, the Kaddish hits everything we need. It helps the individual find their way back to God during their grief. It helps them find their way to the congregation and community during their grief. It helps remind them that they are not alone as the only person who has ever been sad, but that others have felt this way too and come through it and are there to help. And it allows them to be a role model, to be an example to the congregation of finding strength during this time, of finding a way towards God and bringing the congregation with them. So even though the Kaddish is not the oldest of our rituals, it is not surprising that it has become one of the most powerful and commonly observed rituals for grief. Questions, comments? All right, so like I said, it forces us to be with other people rather than being alone, breaking us out of our isolation. It forces us to actually confront our feelings about God. Sometimes people will be angry at God during their time of grief. By saying the Kaddish, they have to actually acknowledge their feelings and then work them through. And of course, it puts us in a position of daily prayer and reflection. which is for some people a first time in their life. They may not have engaged in prayer as regularly. So Kaddish has so many additional benefits that go beyond just the simple words. Once the year is up, there are a few other rituals that we engage in on an ongoing basis for the rest of our life. Unfortunately, the additional slides do not seem to have come through, so you're going to have to deal with the verbal version. So the first thing to know about is what's called the Yartzeit. The Yartzeit is a great Yiddish word, and it means sort of the year time, which is the anniversary of a death, of someone passing away, is a time when we also say Kaddish in the synagogue and during our services. It's also a time when we light a candle in remembrance of the person who has departed, and we bring them to mind more keenly. We think about them, we remember them, and over time, of course, that memory turns from grief to being one of more the fond times that we spent together. And that annual remembrance of a loved one will continue on the anniversary of their death for the entirety of their life. The other custom, which has been around for about 1,000 years or so now, is called Yizkor, or Yizkor, if you want to use more of the proper Hebrew pronunciation rather than the Yiddish. This is a custom that began after the massacre of so many people during the Crusades by the Crusaders, where at major holidays, that is to say, during Pesach, Shavuot, and Shmini Atzeret, in addition to Yom Kippur as well, we set aside a portion of the service during the Torah service where we bring to mind our loved ones and all of the people who have passed in our community or throughout Jewish history, and especially those who were killed for their Jewishness. And during those moments of Yizkor, we more powerfully direct ourselves to hold on to their memory for good, to see them as being still bound into life, and make sure that their memory is something that we build on and never forget. So Yartzeit and Yizkor are the ways that annually we remember all of our loved ones going forward. This is why we make sure to note the date of death to be able to remind ourselves on the Jewish calendar of that anniversary each year. As a small academic aside, if you are studying Jewish history, you will often know exactly when somebody died. That will be recorded very clearly in historical documents. You very rarely will find the date they were born. People were not as careful at not noting down birthdays in the old world because so many babies died. Plus, you didn't know if a person was going to be famous when they were a baby. By the time they had had a life of great accomplishments that would make it into a history book, now we knew who you were. And that's why we made note of when you passed away. So you'll often find very good record keeping for the passing of great Jewish people, even if you don't know exactly when they were born. Any other questions or comments? Or else we will wrap it up for this afternoon. It can be about this topic or others, as we still have a few more minutes. While you're thinking of questions you may want to ask, just one more reminder that next week, because it is the day before Rosh Hashanah, we will not be having class. There is no class next Thursday. I'm not seeing anything in the YouTube chat, and I'm not seeing anybody raising their hand for these questions. So we'll go ahead and finish up for today. Thank you all very much. I look forward to spending New Year's together, and I hope that everybody has a wonderful and blessed 5781, the new year that we are heading towards. Take care and be in touch if you have any questions. Be well. Goodbye.